Hi, welcome everybody. This is NGA's Water Policy Learning Network, and this is our webinar on SRFs and leveraging SRFs and using them to focus on under-resourced communities. So I just wanted to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted along with a few slides that we're going to show on NGA's website afterwards. We want to make this a discussion-based webinar, so I'm asking you all to send your questions or your comments or suggestions in the chat throughout the discussion so the speakers can address them or I can pose them to the speakers. So NGA has been working on equity and stormwater funding, and we've been looking at the SRFs, the state revolving fund, as part of our discussion during a workshop with Delaware River Basin states. So then we started talking to Tim and a few others and decided to have this webinar. So to discuss how to expand the use of the SRF, investments in green infrastructure, and how to better assist under-resourced communities. So let me take a moment to introduce our speakers and thank them for joining us. We have Tim Mayle. He's the founder and executive director at the Environmental Policy Innovation Center called EPIC. Prior to EPIC, he served as an associate director at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and he was vice president for conservation policy at Defenders of Wildlife. He was director at National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and a co-director of agriculture policy at Environmental Defense Fund. And he is also a former elected city official from Maryland. He's also joined by Katie Hansen, the senior advisor at EPIC, at Environmental Policy Innovation Center. And her work focuses on improving equity in local public service provision. She also leads projects on financing water infrastructure, and she has a PhD from Duke University. And we're also joined by T. Thomas, who brings 15 or more years of water financing and environmental equity experience to Quantified Ventures. She recently served as the water finance director for the state of Vermont. And in that role, she managed more than $500 million worth of loans, grants, and contracts related to water financing. Prior to her tenure in Vermont, she worked with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources Drinking Water Program, and later with the Iowa Department of Transportation as the NEPA Policy Act manager. So I wanted to welcome all the speakers, and just to get us started, I wanted to ask Tim, why are you working on this issue? What has interested you in this issue? Where do you see that advances can be made on increasing the effectiveness and the impact of SRF spending?
Thanks so much, Bevan. And I want to say that, you mentioned that I worked at the White House Council on Environmental Quality for a few years, 2014 to 2017. And I worked on water. I was one of the main representatives working on water. And I kid you not, I did not know the acronym SRF while I was there. I still, to this day, don't know how that's possible. But it points to why we work on it today. This is a program that's invested $150 billion in partnership with states since 1987 in water infrastructure. That's incredible. And again, I feel like an idiot for not knowing anything about it before, basically leaving a time at CEQ. It's the largest source of capital from states and from the federal government focused on water infrastructure. It's increasing rapidly in size, both because of all the legislation I know you all have heard about, the Senate Infrastructure Bill, reconciliation package, which could make it grow substantially. But it's also been growing because the states run the program with EPA so well that the amount of money that goes into the annual federal and state appropriations, the capitalization grant it's called from the EPA and the federal perspective, that money is now proportional to the amount of money coming into the program from loan repayments. It's starting to be less than half of or more, way less than half of the amount being loaned out every year. So it's a real example of an extremely successful program in terms of its size, its repayment rate. We're focused on it because this is a sort of once in a generation opportunity to think about how to use the program even better to focus on the needs of disadvantaged communities and populations that have just not gotten assistance from that program in the past. It's just not addressing the kind of potential that it has to reach far more Americans and more communities and places that really need that help. So I think that's the sort of at the broadest level, why the program is so important, or programs, I should say, right? the 2 federal programs, the clean water and the drinking water SRF, and then all the 50 and territorial versions of those programs. So I think I'll stop there. I would love to hear what Katie has next in terms of like how this connects to green infrastructure and more in the details of disadvantaged communities in this program.
Bevan, you're on mute.
Thanks. Let's turn to Katie and T and ask them about the current state of play with the state revolving funds. I'll try not to use the acronym so so people really know what it is by the time of this webinar. So what's the current state of investment, and then why is it so hard to invest SRF funds in green infrastructure?
Right. So my slides are up.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay. So the program is extremely flexible, we should say, and that the states receive their portion of the federal funds and then get to decide through legislation and through the goals that the administrative agency puts out on how to allocate those funds. And what we've done at EPIC and T has also done at Quantified Ventures is look at which types of projects and which types of communities tend to be funded or tend to receive support through this program. And what we find overall is that very little of the funds are going to invest in green infrastructure projects. So overall, the average is around 2.7% of the total amount of investments and infrastructure that is financed through this program is channeled to green infrastructure. And that's changing. So here we have some sort of best in class states, the top 5 states as how much of their clean water program is being invested in green infrastructure. And Vermont in the last 5 years has invested about 21% in green infrastructure. Hawaii and Minnesota are also very high. And so the question is, why is it hard? Why is the average so low in terms of how much green infrastructure is financed through the program? And there are several reasons. So the main reason that you hear over and over again is that there are not as clear of repayment streams on the green infrastructure side as the gray infrastructure side. So with wastewater treatment plants and pipes, users are charged a service fee, and that money can then be used to repay the loan that the borrower receives. Unless there's a stormwater utility, there isn't as clear of a user base to repay investments in green infrastructure. And that is a real opportunity for thinking creatively on how to create those repayment streams, which we can touch on later. I think another big barrier in terms of investing in green infrastructure is that administrative agencies just lack the staff to help with the project development. So we know that the number of staff in these state agencies has not increased very much, even though the volume of loans and grants that they're giving out has. And so it's really difficult to process the paperwork and keep the borrowers in compliance with the federal regulations for these funds. And doing something different, which green infrastructure is a newer type of project compared to the gray infrastructure that folks have been using federal funds to invest in for 50, 60 years, it takes more time and there's just a real staff constraint. In many cases, it's conservation groups that are doing the green infrastructure work, and they largely rely on grants. So they might not be aware of the clean water program and its potential to take out a loan and to fund some of these programs. And most states do not lend directly to nonprofit or for-profit groups. So the money is going off to municipalities and to other entities. And so if you have conservation groups that are really driving a lot of the investment and they're not aware of the program and not eligible to receive the funding, that's a real barrier to using this program for green infrastructure.
So Katie, on that point with
Yeah.
conservation groups, I'm familiar with a lot of small conservation groups doing projects. So dedicated revenue stream for repayment of a loan might be an issue with that. Can you speak to that? I mean, or
That
I might be able to field that one, Katie, if that's
Right.
helpful. So a lot of organizations can, if they're larger national organizations, can rely on, their actual like cash reserves, sometimes the actual asset like land that's being purchased. We can put a mortgage on the land that's being purchased. And then often again, in this like project development piece, we're looking for who benefits from the project. So if it benefits an industry or if it can help match up with like in the agriculture world, sometimes we can get some support from for-profit companies because they benefit from like their sustainability goals. So there's all kinds of different ways that we can identify a repayment stream. But the smaller the organization, the challenge goes up. So there's no doubt that that's more of a challenge.
you're seeing this with the smaller ones and the national level ones too, that are more well-funded.
In terms of the organizations that are using the SRF.
Oh, no,
stuff?
yeah, that they're not getting loans from the SRF to do green infrastructure projects.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume the ones that have are the larger national
Okay.
ones. But again, 2% is overall
Right.
nationally. So yeah.
Okay. Very small percent. Okay, thanks.
I just think I have one more point here and then we can head out. Oh, which is that municipalities tend to hire engineers when they're trying to think about how to solve their water quality issues. And that leads to these engineered grade solutions because of the expertise that they're turning to. And so what we're trying to think about in terms of addressing these barriers is how municipalities can look at green infrastructure, planting trees, restoring floodplains, restoring wetlands, to address their stormwater and their combined sewer overflows and nutrient reduction challenges. And to that, it requires reaching out to a set of experts with a broader lens on ways to address those problems.
All right, thanks, Katie. And I just want to encourage our participants to put things in the chat, put questions, comments, suggestions in the chat if you have them, and we can ask them to the speakers. So I wanted to ask, I guess, direct this to Tim or T, whichever one wants to field this one. What are some creative approaches and best practices you've seen in states or that you've done yourself in T's case to increase SRF investments in green infrastructure and to leverage SRF dollars?
I think I'll start on this, and then Tim, if you want to jump in, feel free to do so. So in thinking through, I mean, there are lots of great examples about how different states are being creative. I think one of the great opportunities that is not being used a lot in the SRF world is the use of credit enhancements and credit backing. I think the Environmental Finance Advisory Board a few years ago did a study saying that SRF guarantees could open up somewhere between $6 and $28 billion in additional funding and financing capacity. So I think Penvest has started a credit enhancement assistance program where they basically say, if we don't have enough loan money for you, we can work with you on a credit enhancement assistance. So this works just like someone underwriting a loan or backing a loan for you. So I think there's a lot of potential in that type of program. Have not spent a bunch of time digging into how much traction that enhancement program has gotten, but definitely worth digging into. In Vermont, when I was there, we did a lot of coordinating with conservation groups to try to say, how can we help you? And what we found is that it takes a very long time to put together all the grants that are needed for green projects and green infrastructure, and particularly land conservation. And so what we created was what we called the Natural Infrastructure Interim Financing Program, which gave very generous terms and depressed repayments, essentially paying very low amounts for, I think, up to like 5 years, and then a balloon payment in the final year of the loan. So just, there's incredible flexibility within the SRFs. So we had a lot of success just trying to change the narrative of the conservation finance and water investment world with some of these nonprofits that are working on these projects, and being able to really try and communicate the idea that getting a loan, a very inexpensive loan in year one, is better than lost opportunity cost, or a project costs are tripling over time. So had a lot of success with that program. I think there's been a lot of talk already about sponsorship programs. So Ohio has a very successful sponsorship program called their WRRSP program. It's been around since about 2000. And this sponsorship is kind of confusing, but I'll just sort of, it's like a buy one, get one free. A municipality sponsors their traditional clean water project, and then they're able to sponsor a green infrastructure project and to get that project forgiven. So Iowa has also created a sponsorship program. I think I might want to say Oregon also has done this. So there's also opportunities in the additional subsidy world. So SRF talks about loans that are already subsidized and less expensive loans. But there are a lot of states doing a lot of creative things with the free portion of the SRFs, which is either loan forgiveness or a grant. And I think, there are all kinds of opportunities for states to look at how they allocate the additional subsidy and potentially to consider using that for green infrastructure. So one of my favorite examples that I've seen recently is New Jersey allocating about $10 million of their additional subsidy for harmful algal blooms. So there are lots of ways that those funds can be used. And I think that's just like a smattering of some examples. Tim, is there anything you want to say about Maryland here? You want to talk about that?
Yeah.
First, can I jump in and ask you about the principal forgiveness? So when a community is under-resourced and they don't have a lot of funds and maybe they're close to bankruptcy, how are they able to qualify for a loan under the SRF with their bad financials to be able to get that loan and then ask for the principal forgiveness to get that loan forgiven?
Yeah, so that situation's really challenging. Any loan has to be able to pass underwriting, right? The exemptions to that might be a 100% forgiven loan, right? Like if you need $1 million, we give you a loan for $1 million and we forgive all of it. But that's not that common. So I think a lot of states do a lot to work with other state and federal funding sources to try and make the projects as affordable as possible. I know there are states that have people that actually work on their user rate structure to try and make sure they're charging sufficiently, but the challenges are real. Infrastructure is very expensive.
Right. All right, let's turn to Tim. And Tim, did you have an example of?
Yeah, I wanted to give an example, but I just wanted to follow up on the point that T just made, which is that 100% forgiveness is not that common, but it could be. It could be not common, but it could be a little bit more common than it is today. And again, if I were in any state, looking at this program, I'd look at the growth of the loan capacity on an annual basis. and look at how rapidly or slowly that's growing and say, is there a way we could squeeze in $1 million or $2 million of that kind of support per year and still grow, right? And still grow at a rate that's greater than the rate of inflation or whatever benchmark that the state wanted to set for itself. And I think that's a way to bring in just a few more of those projects into the door for communities. And of course, federal legislation may make some of that easier because there's more opportunity for grants or grant-like support coming from at least some of the proposals coming from Congress. The one other example I wanted to mention was Prince George County, Maryland, which did this big partnership, community benefit partnership with a company called Corvius based out of Rhode Island. And they effectively sort of outsourced a lot of the intermediary function of delivering more than 100 green infrastructure projects. And the value add that Corvius provided was that they're running all the subcontracting with these often very small construction firms, planning businesses, the vast majority of which are African-American or minority-owned firms, almost all of which are located within that county or nearby counties. And so, Corvius is simultaneously run like a jobs training program, as well as like a sort of a mini loan capacity building program, using its balance sheet to cover stuff that small businesses wouldn't otherwise be able to cover on their own. I mean, and you all probably have experience with this with small businesses that just get stuck waiting for a public, a repayment to come back on an invoice and just can't bear the, 30, 60, 90, 180 day wait on things like that. So Prince George's County has this really interesting, they're in the second stage of the public-private partnership now. Milwaukee has now launched a similar project with Corvius, and they have one with Chester, the city of Chester, Pennsylvania as well. Mm-hmm. But it's a use of the SRF and of this private balance sheet to together deliver a lot more sort of green infrastructure projects and with significant co-benefit requirements around jobs and disadvantaged communities.
And so specifically how they use the SRF in Prince George's County, and for what part of that public-private partnership did they use it? Just to fund the practices? So the county applied for the funding and then used it to fund.
So exactly. Yep. So it's a $200 million. I can't remember the size of the SRF loan, but a large part of the capital build over 5 years is covered by the SRF, paid back over a longer period of time. And so a portion of that is being used to pay Corvius, which in turn pays the subcontractors. That's a chunk of the payment stream for that project, as well as other county access capital.
All right. Well, yeah, that's interesting. And I wanted to go back and just T asked you about the credit enhancements and credit backing. So how does that work if you can use your SRF to do that, like credit enhancements? So would the state be using SRF funds to enhance the credit worthiness of a municipality that is, on financial shaky ground, or how does that work?
So the SRFs themselves have AAA credit scores. So they are, without having to spend a dollar of the actual fund itself, they're able to enhance the credit of any entity that has poor credit. Not poor credit, that's not what I want to say. Somebody that would have to go maybe to conventional financing and maybe they would be paying 7, 8, 9, 10% with the backing of the SRF. And the best example of this was done in New York several years ago, like in the mid 2000s, where the state of New York backed energy efficiency type of projects with the SRF. So in that case, it was a state agency backing another state agency. I think a lot of the potential lies in maybe those types of organizations, or potentially even like a Corvius, like a for-profit entity or a nonprofit entity that wants to be able to take on debt to do a really cool P3 public-private partnership. To get capital for that, usually you need investment from the outside. That investment can be really expensive. So if there's a way to make it cheaper, then it sort of just makes their do-gooding go a little bit further.
All right, thanks, T. So I wanted to turn to Tim again, and turn to Tim to lead off, and then you let you all chime in. So what are some state policies that governors can advance to increase and leverage the SRF investment? I know that these there's a certain amount of flexibility in the state programs for the states to put their stamp on it and administer this program. So what are some policies that you've seen or you've practiced that you would like to share with the other states and the other governors' advisors?
There we go. This is one of the first things we connected around. There are, as you probably all know, there's, I think in every state, some authorizing legislation that enables the SRF programs. And then a lot of what happens that T just described, for example, happens just through adopted practice over time, the accumulation of initiatives by different individuals. We think it's really valuable in every state to look at the current authorities you have and look at room for improvement. And we started a project a couple of years ago in Maryland focused on that question in partnership with the state of Maryland, with the Hogan administration, and came up with some legislation that it didn't pass last year. It's got Governor Hogan's support as the top legislative priority for the Chesapeake Bay this year, introduced by Democrats. The anticipation is that it'll be introduced by Democrats in both the Senate and the House. And a big chunk of that bill is around just enabling some of the kinds of things that T just described, and we were just discussing explicitly in the Maryland statute. So if Katie, if you could just pull up that slide, this is once you see the slide here, this is sort of a list of the legislative fixes that would be in this bill that changes the code in Maryland. It took about 1,500 words to accomplish this, so it's not a monumental task to adjust the authorities. I'm not aware of any SRF statute that's particularly long in the first place, so it's a really flexible program. The authorities are pretty broad. And what we did in this legislation called the Comprehensive Finance Act, Conservation Finance Act, and I can send a copy of the legislative text to anyone interested, is we made it clear, T referenced this, that nonprofits and for-profits are eligible for loan guarantees, that created explicit language around disadvantaged communities being able to get full-on grants, planning grants associated with the work that it takes to put projects together. And a lot of that sort of pre-development work that they just wouldn't otherwise have capital to do. The legislation authorizes clearly, makes clear that you can, and this is already true under federal law, but it makes clear that you can give loans to cross-governmental entities. So that might be a council of governments or some other legislatively created body. In Maryland, Pennsylvania, there's a Susquehanna River Basin Commission, for example, that they're eligible to receive loans. We looked at, and as many of you know, there's an annual basically prioritization of projects that comes out for both programs that goes through public comment and review. This legislation in Maryland would put utility consolidation, lead pipe replacement, and green infrastructure for burdened communities into the priority list for the SRFs, both the drinking water, I think in various ways, both the drinking water and the clean water SRF. And then I'll just go through these last ones pretty quickly. Another thing done in this legislation is basically to explicitly tell the state agencies that where you have a couple of different programs, we really want you to look hard at applications that come from these multiple places. And that's important, again, to the question you were just asking about, then where you might have programs that are pure grant programs. And if you have an applicant who's put together, a project that has grant funding for some parts of the work, and then needs loans for other parts of it that can bear the refinancing costs, financing costs of loans, that those things would get lifted up in the queue. We've talked about sponsorship already. I'll just mention two other things. Throughout the code, this potential code revision in Maryland, there's authorizations for things like forest protection, wellhead, or source water protection. To make clear that that's an authorized use of particularly the clean water SRF. And then this language around subsidized bank loans, or what's called linked deposit programs, not something that's used to a great extent in Maryland to date, mostly for things like farmer equipment to do sustainability practices that contribute to water quality, but room to use it more broadly to basically for the SRF to provide a loan subsidy on top of what would otherwise be the market rate that a bank might give, let's say, a local land trust to do some forest protection or land management work that enhances green infrastructure near communities. And so being able to use that basically bank loan process, but have the SRF behind the scenes in the back end be lowering the cost of borrowing, by the private party from the bank is another opportunity. So this kind of analysis is possible in any state. Katie might talk about some of the stuff we know is going on in the Great Lakes states, but we'd just sort of love to see this happen in far more states across the country, most especially if some of the new legislation passes Congress, but even if it doesn't, these are all things that can be authorized under current federal law.
Yeah, so Tim, did you want to, or T, did you want to talk about this as well? And Katie, or do you want to give any more information on these or discuss about, what you anticipate with, hopefully if and when the infrastructure package passes, how much the impact that's going to have on the SRFs and the need to get more funding out through the SRFs?
I can just add the conversations that I've had with my former SRF manager colleagues nationally. I think, again, staffing is so important for the SRFs, and I think there's already some challenges in terms of having enough capacity. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to try and collaborate with P3 opportunities, other agencies. There's all kinds of great opportunities to try and think of efficient ways to get the money out the door. But I think it's kind of scary, just the amount of money that's coming to states right now, and just trying to make sure that money, as Tim said, is sort of this once in a generation amount of spending, and really just trying to think of thoughtful ways to assist states with getting that money out the door in a way that's both equitable and green and helps our communities grow. So it's going to be a challenge over the next 5 years or 6 years, assuming the infrastructure bill passes.
Right. So also, Tim and T and Katie, have you seen some elements of what you showed us on the screen that you said all of that was in the Maryland bill? Have you seen elements of that from different states where some states are doing one or two of these things, or have any states put all that together yet into one package, or is Maryland the first one that's attempting that? And what's the outlook for that?
Well, I'll say I have some home state pride, and I'll say Maryland would be the first one to put them all in one in legislation. But absolutely, none of these are new ideas, and every one of them has been already been done, or a few of them have been done by multiple states. So this is a way to build it into the legislation. But states are, and T, you gave some great examples of like with sponsorship programs where states have really full on implemented some of this capacity in a really meaningful way. So definitely that's credit for being racing ahead on actual implementation. Maryland's just trying to catch up with a legislative framework that authorizes it all.
So T, with the sponsorship programs, as I understood it, when a utility is doing a project to upgrade their wastewater treatment plant or something like that, if they take on and sponsor a green infrastructure project or a stormwater project, then they get their interest rate lowered even more. So it kind of ends up paying totally for the stormwater project or the green infrastructure project that they're sponsoring. Is that how it works?
That is right. So I think different states do it differently, but like Ohio, which is kind of the standard that's been around for the longest period of time, I think they give the municipality like a 0.01% interest rate. And I think what they've found is that there's a lot of, pride in being able to support some of the green projects that come along with those projects. So there's a couple of ways that it benefits municipalities there. Yep.
Right. So in terms of taking advantage of, in terms of taking advantage of it, on the state level can governors do? Is it a need for more education about this being available? I mean, it seems to me like every project ought to have ought to be supporting or adopting a green infrastructure project. Is it the workload aspect, or is it education that's available, or is it connecting the people that are going to do that on the ground project? Or is it usually the municipality that's also doing the green infrastructure project, or are they pulling in nonprofit groups to do them? What's the challenge to?
Is that specifically for sponsorship? Like, why isn't sponsorship
for
done
sponsorship
everywhere?
project? Yeah. Like, is this being picked up and used a lot, or is it, what could help it be better?
I mean, there are states that are, we would say, oversubscribed, so they use every single dollar that they have for sort of more traditional gray infrastructure projects, and the demand is so high that I think there's not as much of there's not leftover funds to be contemplating other uses. Not that you couldn't still do loan. I mean, there are other things that you can do to sort of expand that, but I think, there's a lot of demand. In Vermont, we wrote sponsorship into our legislation, and we are still, it was 3 years ago that passed through the legislature, and it was just, it still is trying to get off the ground because it's a staffing issue. You have to make sure you actually have entities that understand the SRF. So there is a little bit of that, just like that implementation of it. But I think the states that have been really successful are ones that saw the value that you're seeing, that Tim saw, and many of us see with sponsorship, and they actually dedicate staff time to sort of that implementation. So I think when resources are short and we're just trying to kind of keep the lights on, I think that extra programs that feel very extra and different can be a little bit of a challenge to implement. So I would say, prioritizing it, staffing it, and I think it is possible in a lot of states.
And if I could jump in there just for a second, thinking about the power of governors and their staff, and the way that I would frame this challenge is, look, we need to figure out how to do some things differently. So we need some skill sets that we don't have today, whether you're framing it around climate resilience or simply just protecting communities from flooding, or it's really around, water quality and, local benefits and co-benefits of sort of semi-natural places or places that see lots of impacts from weak water quality. We need to do it differently, and we need local organizations and local jobs providers that know how to do that. And so if you said, look, I want to see 5 of the applications on our next intended use plan that have a sponsored green infrastructure project in it, and I want every one of those 5 projects to have a very local community group as a partner, and somewhat, maybe that's that same group, or maybe it's another group who's who's got a little bit more capacity and experience building green infrastructure. I want to see that in the queue, because we need to develop basically those skills. I really almost think of it as a jobs training program and a capacity building program. So if you launched an initiative like that and said, I want to see that in my next intended use plan, whether you're a fully allocated state or not, I bet you'd see a response from the applicant pool to do that. And as the whole sponsorship program, and I'll just say as an outsider to SRFs, there's all these sort of strange peculiarities with the language, right? Like, from your perspective, there's a lot. The paperwork's different, but it's basically like a grant, right? It's money that you're not having to pay back as the project lead. Well, whenever there's grant programs, everybody runs, right? Like we apply for grants. And so at the end of the day, if you simplify it and say, look, it's got all these complexities at the one hand, and it's definitely going to be complicated for the SRF administrator to issue, and for the utility or the community that's doing a loan with the sponsorship project piggybacked on it, it's going to be a little more complicated for them. But from the community group, the provider's perspective, you can see it as a grant to support projects you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. I think that's the way I think about it from a like just getting past the terminology perspective and just trying to get this to happen at a faster rate in the state.
Thanks, Tim. Hey, I want to pick up on something you said about the intended use plan and ask you, what governors can do to target. You mentioned something, something in there about to to better assist under-resourced communities pay for stormwater and green infrastructure. And you mentioned, one thing about the intended use program. How else what else can they put in that intended use program? And T, you can help us here too, because I'm sure you helped prepare it for Vermont when you were administering their funds. So what can they put in that intended use program to make sure funds are targeted to under-resourced communities? And there is that 30 or 10% of funds that states have to use for additional assistance. What's it called? Additional, well, there's
Additional subsidy.
subsidy, right, which is grants, principal forgiveness. There's 10% they have to use, there's 30% they can use, but what other things and what other things can governors pull to increase assistance to under-resourced communities?
Katie, do you actually want to take that? I think we might have a slide for that, unless Tim, you want to jump in there. Okay.
Go for it.
I'll start. Yeah, I think we have the two big ways to increase how much money is going to under-resourced communities is by providing technical assistance. So you can imagine if you're a small system and there's just not much capacity in terms of technical training or time to try to wade through the paperwork, having assistance in trying to figure out what's the funding cycle and how to fill out the application and what requirements must be in place before it is approved can be really helpful. And so we've thought about different ways and could pick up on who is providing technical assistance to communities to apply for SRFs and then to carry out their paperwork, and how could we leverage other third party and look at different types of intermediaries that might be able to increase the amount of technical assistance in addition to what the state provides. So that technical assistance is on the sort of application side, and then when the state does receive applications, thinking about how they allocate their assistance. So like you said, that many places can pay back loans, but some can't, and those that can't will require essentially grants, but what is called principal forgiveness or from SRFs. Those are two big things. Do you have others to dive in there?
We have some overarching, so Bevan, I don't know, maybe it would be helpful just to sort of talk through recommendations, just sort of more in general about the intended use plan.
Sure,
that's
yeah.
key, the IUPs, and just ways that beyond the legislative fixes that Tim had mentioned. So Katie, do you have the slide that you can pull up? And Tim, I'll touch on these at a high level, but if there's anything in here that you want to jump in on, please do. So in general, more money is always better than less money. So the infrastructure bill is going to go a long way to helping to fill the gap, but we always know, there's always going to be more need than we have funding available. As I mentioned, there are a lot of states that they're using every single penny that they have. All the money they get from EPA, all of their 30 years of repayments have been essentially spoken for the projects that exist on the ground. So I think ways that we can extend the reach of those SRFs and also provides, more loan money for all of the infrastructure, those who own, but also just creates the overall larger pot of money would be either loan guarantees or leveraging of their program. And by leveraging of their program, we're really talking about them, going through a bonding process to like extend the reach of their program. And then updating, so this is a pretty tangible thing in that IUP process. Sometimes this is in statute or rule, and sometimes this is something that the programs have more flexibility on during the IUP process, and that's how do you prioritize projects? Are you giving 2 points for a green infrastructure project, or are you giving, 25 points? And what we're doing during that prioritization project is, if funds are competitive, we're figuring out where the line is drawn and who's below that. And then beyond that, every state has a clean water SRF affordability criteria that they've developed. And I think also just incorporating those components into the prioritization. So that is just another opportunity. A lot of the projects that we're talking about, and the reason that I personally started getting interested in these types of projects when I was in Vermont is a lot of my municipalities were struggling with cost, with user fees. Infrastructure is getting more expensive. In Vermont specifically, we have an aging population, a declining rural population, very, very small municipalities. And I think when we can think a little bit bigger and we can think about water as a watershed, I think there are ways that we can save the global multiple of us a lot of money. So I think if there's a way to put some of the technical assistance that Katie mentioned into, watershed assistance to kind of help connect. I was talking with a state in the Gulf the other day, and one community was getting bombarded with stormwater, and the community above it just did a brand new housing development, right? And trying to be a little bit smarter and thinking at the watershed level, and resources are pretty important.
So they need specific authorization to lend to multi jurisdiction entities.
I think it'll depend on the state, so kind of what the state statute already says, but I think the real opportunity here is to get assistance to going back to Katie's technical assistance side. I think there's more than just helping with the actual application process. I think there's also really trying to think a little bit bigger and broader on watershed planning. So I think really there are some opportunities to provide that assistance with some organizations that are kind of already doing that in this space.
Sure. And if there is an authorization, I guess that you could hesitate to do it, because if you're not authorized to do it, you might think, okay, well, we can't do this. Sure. We'll get in some kind of trouble, or,
Definitely.
Right. Okay. And let me let you go on.
I'll just touch briefly on these and then turn this back over to Katie or Tim. But in terms of access, Katie's already talked about this. It's everyone's talking about this right now. EPA is talking about this. We're in lots of different circles. There's a lot of people trying to answer the question about how do we get the funds to the people that need it the most, and how do we make the process as painless as possible. The state of Washington has done an incredible job with centralizing their application. So you go to one place and you get access to an entire funding portfolio. So I really think there are opportunities for other states to provide those same support. And then I think the last one is really just dedicate, right? Like states that are oversubscribed or whatever, I think there is just a question of really prioritizing the use of available funds for green infrastructure and non-point source projects. So I think these are some recommendations, just really making it a priority and making it like I want to see this in the intended use plan. Katie or Tim.
And I do see some comments in the chat box too from Deirdre Finn of CIFA. That's, she's saying that drinking water SRFs can use 1% of their capitalization grant for technical assistance, but clean water SRFs cannot. And so states fund technical assistance through fees and other revenue sources. And she said the infrastructure bill that's before the Congress now will allow clean water SRFs to use 2% of the capitalization grant for technical assistance provided by not-for-profit, and that's for small communities. So hopefully we'll see some movement there.
Yeah, those are great comments. And I think the opportunity for states is both to think about how do you use some of that technical assistance to help get partner organizations that are really good at community outreach, like really good at engaging with the diverse communities. So that's one part of it. And the other part, and Katie definitely emphasized this as well as T, it's complicated to apply for this money, right? So you need people who are, I don't want to say creative accountants because that term usually means something else, but who are really good at accounting and, you know, and like doing like the whole credit worthiness evaluation and helping places figure out how to, you know, how to do it in a way that fits their circumstance and conditions. So it's a funny mix of technical assistance that's both really on the ground, like people skills, and then like obtuse math skills and understanding of complicated rules.
Right.
So both of those parts of technical assistance are really, I think, crucial to getting, you know, some of the communities that have just never gotten in the door on these programs, the assistance they need. I want to back up on the intended use plan just to again sort of demystify that term a little bit. It's this combination of points, right? Scoring points that applications get when they come in. Think of like Olympic divers, right? Like they have points for different things. Like every state has a point system, and sometimes those point systems are really have very strange outcomes. You know, they give a lot of points for one thing and then just very few points for something else. And so you know how that's going to turn out. The points are part of it. And then the intended use plan is also the result of the points system and the set of applications they get in. So it's basically, this is the list of projects we got, this is how they rank, and this is what we're planning to fund this year. So it's almost like not a plan, it's like a public update on the queue of projects you're intending to fund this year and you know, the ones that have a good chance of making it in next year. So it's really like a queue. It's the kind of thing where, you know, again, a governor could say, I want a briefing on the intended use plan from last year. What did we see a lot of? What did we not see a lot of? And, you know, as soon as you get that plan together in draft form this year, given that it's, you know, however many hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever the number is going out, I want a briefing on that too, and what projects we're most excited about. And that's just a sort of very simple way to get to sort of demystify and simplify the whole thing and say like which communities are getting money to do different things that we saw before. And you know, we've talked a lot about green infrastructure. We haven't talked about lead pipe replacement, but whatever the set of priorities are that a governor might have on their plate, it's a really easy thing to ask about in the cycle of the intended use plan, because and you can say, well, you know, what are we doing? Or which small pieces of otherwise really big projects are related to, you know, to my priorities and my interests, and can we do, how do we lift that project up? How do we help them get it done faster? So it can be really complicated, but there are ways to simplify the kind of questions and kind of briefings that governors and their staffs would get about the SRF program and the kinds of loans and other kinds of assistance going out.
All right, thanks. I think, so T, you already gave us some ideas on getting underserved communities to use green infrastructure. Did you have more, or am I just looking at this message a little late? Did you have more to add?
No, I think we're, Katie, is there anything you wanted to add on that, or you're okay there?
We're hot potatoing this last little bit.
Yeah.
I think it's the piece on putting it together. So we know that green infrastructure has a lot of co-benefits, and the question is when and how can we encourage green infrastructure projects in underserved communities. And I think just to underscore the points that have been made, it'll be these partnership opportunities and the broader watershed view on thinking about what is happening upstream in terms of degradation or what's causing water quality issues and because unfortunately we know underserved communities tend to be in low-lying downstream areas and are going to be the recipients of a lot of what's happening upstream. And so I guess I would just tie together all of the ideas about investing in green infrastructure and the ideas about investing in underserved communities really do come together in a way that the communities that may benefit most from more green infrastructure are likely in low-lying downstream areas. And so I think that this conversation makes sense in their two component pieces and combined more so.
Right, thanks. Good points, Katie. So I just wanted to go back and look at the chat, and I know there was some clarification of I guess it was the percentage of the capitalization used for green infrastructure projects. And I think T, you clarified that and said you're looking at non-point source projects and not just the green project reserve projects, right?
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so all non-point source projects. Great.
Yeah. And then I think Deidre's shared a lot of really helpful stuff also in the chat about different state profiles and and some more information about the IUP. So I would encourage anyone to save those links because there's a lot of great information there in states that you might be interested in.
Right, and so those are annual, it's an annual exercise you have to do those intended use programs, right?
Yeah, and the only other thing I would add to that is there's also a public component to all of these IUPs. Like states want to hear from you and they want to hear from these projects. They want to hear from the greater public. So there is a public comment period, usually some version of a virtual hearing. And most states that I know of are pretty responsive to what they hear from their constituents. So yeah, that's also something to pay attention to. And also most states that I know really do want to fund green infrastructure. It's just a question of I think a lot of, how do we have baked projects brought to them that have great equity outcomes? So I think there's a lot of very willing states out there that are ready to have these conversations. I think we just got a few ingredients that we got to work in there.
Right. And sometimes I feel like it's easy for us to say, oh, states provide more technical assistance, but I know states are strapped for cash and can't just hire a bunch of technical assistance positions too. So, what's one solution you've seen out there that states have been able to tap, or that states could coordinate to get technical assistance to those under-resourced communities that need them?
I can jump in here. Okay. I mean, one of the ways to make it happen is where an organization is providing that technical assistance as part of the process of developing a loan or a project. And then the technical assistance gets covered, after the fact, effectively, when the loan comes through as part of the overall cost of the package. And so you need to, per our conversation earlier about, really small nonprofits, it's somebody may have to hold that lack of income for a while on their own balance sheet, or they may have to have a community grant or something else to enable them to support the community through the application process. But that kind of thing can and should happen all the time. And that's one way to deal with maybe the lag in the state's ability to provide it, or the inability of the state to be able to just simply pay for some additional capacity. T, is that a reasonable answer from your perspective, or Katie? Yeah. And Bevan, just knowing we're about to run out of time, I just say, like, this piece, the part of the question you just asked about technical assistance, the recommendations we made before, again, especially if Congress passes any of this money, use that authority. States should use that authority around technical assistance to create more capacity focused on these disadvantaged communities, rural communities, urban communities, wherever they are. Like that's going to be right in front of you in a way that didn't exist before. And even though it's 1 or 2% or this sort of relatively small percentage, it's part of a really big number. And so you can definitely get technical assistance value there. I'd also say that it's a reasonable thing for governors to ask their staff to give them a briefing on current statutory authorities. And if there's some creative stuff we could be doing that our neighbors are doing, for example, that's just not in there right now, just basically a refresh. That's not it's not a hard thing to do. And based on the SRF leaders that we know in states, so many of them have ideas that would be relevant if they were asked, that kind of question. So that would be a second thing. And, and the third one I'd say is just engaging with community partners to try to build some of these big sort of projects that have different features, that have green and gray, or water quality benefits, but also flood risk reduction benefits. It takes some handholding, even if it's not technical support. It's just about convening people to really, identify kind of projects like that as a priority. And leaders can do that as well, can say, like, we really want to make these kinds of investments in this community happen, and let's use the SRF to do that. And that itself creates some momentum. So sort of put your personal stamp on this program, because there's a lot of opportunity to use it flexibly to get the kinds of infrastructure that, almost every governor has someone, either themselves or someone on their staff that, that has a project that could fit with what
Right.
the SRF
Great,
can do.
Tim. I love that, because that's a good summation for, what can governors do, and just, get a briefing on this program. Ask your administrators what other states are doing, what could they be doing, what could they be doing better, and to give governors just some information on, the discretion that they do have, and the impact they can have on the intended use plan. If they say, I want to see some different criteria, the projects being judged by different criteria, or add additional criteria that'll take disadvantaged communities into light there. So, and help them out. So yeah, thanks, Tim. I love that summation, and I want to wrap it up here because we are just a minute over time. And I want to thank first Tim, T, and Katie so much for sharing your expertise with us. And I know, Katie, you had a paper on the drinking water SRF that we're going to share with all the participants here today and our network. And we will also be sending everybody a recording of this if you wanted to share it with your fellow staff members, and we'll be posting this on the NGA website. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day. And we're going to wrap it up now. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Bevan. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.